Everything. Like the audience. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. So good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming in to hear me speak and talk about platypuses. I've been involved with researching platypus for about 10 years now. It really happened, I would say, by chance, in a sense, through kind of conversations I've had early on with Tom Grant, a prominent platypus researcher, and other colleagues. We were becoming more and more aware about the deficiencies in our understanding of platypuses and how they're faring and the impact that we've been having on them. And so we were initially successful with collaborative research with Taronga Zoo, and really our activity has just been gaining pace ever since. And I do feel that there's a change, and there's a positive change, but it's obviously very slow. Um, I guess I need to start with like a pretty picture of myself at work, but also give a lot of credit to Dr. Tennille Hawk. She started off as a young PhD student and is now a platypus expert and a colleague. And we both spend many hours in the field studying platypuses and promoting its conservation. So my work is focused, obviously I'm a researcher at the University of New South Wales, and my work is very much focused on studying platypuses. And for that to happen, there are no unfortunate shortcuts. There's a lot of, it's very labor intensive, a lot of hard work. The platypus inhabits a wide range across Eastern Australia. And so like I really spend a lot of time out and about. I think over the years, over the past 10 years, we like together combined myself and Tennille, we spent about a year in the field out of 10. And we've encountered over 500 odd platypuses. All the work is at night. We set nets, and depending on the morphology of the nets, we and kind of check them or stand by the, wait by the nets or check them regularly throughout the night. And when we do catch a platypus, we have a mobile anesthetic setup where all of the platypuses, immediately after they get caught, we put them in a pillowcase. And then from the pillowcase itself, like we induce sedation, we anesthetize the platypuses, and then only then do we take out the platypus and can have a close look at it and take samples and tag it and so forth. So all of the photos that you're seeing here are all sleeping platypuses. And so that's been a real, for my sake, I guess it was something that I insisted on in applying in terms of animal welfare. And it's been very successful. Something that I think I wasn't really prepared for was the amount of engagement that our activities would attract and entail. Obviously the platypus is such an icon, and we all relate and care about these iconic species. It's cute and furry, and it's cryptic, almost like a sense of like mystical in a sense. And it is just an amazing, I would say, a flagship for protecting waterways, platypus, of course, but other species that inhabit our waterways. And so a big focus of our activities is actually education and community outreach. We regularly hold like this evening, but I also go out and about. I've got this third year now with the Department of Education, with the Illawarra Environmental Education Center. We have like a platy camp with kids, and they get to see science in action and so forth. So, and just regularly giving people the opportunity to share this unique animal, and give them an opportunity to really, like, this couple here in the photo spent their entire life and only seeing glimpses of platypuses on their property, and it's a real privilege to be able to actually invite them and share this wonderful creature and really touch the hearts of communities and find pathways where we share a vision for healthy rivers and protecting our platypuses. Jason, I think like can someone mute? I'm just getting a bit of feedback. Sorry. Whoever isn't muted. Sorry. So the number one question, and I still have to tackle this, is what is the correct plural term of platypus? It's derived from a Greek word meaning flat foot, and so because it's Greek and not Latin, then the correct pluralization of Greek words would be platypodes. But because this word has already been assimilated into the English language, then we revert to the us's. So platypus is the correct term, not platypi. So I still have to like grapple with this one wherever I go. Our understanding of platypuses has definitely been increasing, gaining significant pace in the 1990s onwards in terms of like our scientific understanding about the unique features of the platypus, its life history. But something that's been very much lagging was really understanding the conservation status and the impact that we've been having on platypuses. And that's really when we started getting quite active about 10 years ago and really trying to promote through research and an understanding of all of these elements. But there's a lot of resources online. There's the book written by Tom Grant, The Platypus. But there's also the top left there is it's an open, free, accessible review that we did about the platypus. And so if you're really curious to learn more, I welcome you to go and have a look. The platypus is quite an extraordinary and evolutionary unique species. It's one of, along with the echidna, it's only one of 5 egg-laying mammals. Evolutionary, it diverged from the mammalian branch about 200 million years ago. That's before the flower was first evolved. Dinosaurs were still roaming around. We see fossils of the ancestral species of platypuses in South America. I'm sure we would find in Antarctica if we looked, and in other places on continental Australia. And because of this, and this divergence happened before placental and marsupials diverged. So this kind of unique lineage that's rooted very deep in time holds a number of quite unique characteristics that make it quite an icon. It's like I said, it's a mammal that lays eggs. You can it needs to build a nest, and I'll get to that in the side of banks. So it digs burrows and constructs a nest chamber, and then carries nesting material. You've got a photo there of a platypus carrying nesting material with her back tail there. They construct a nest top right, and they lay 1 or 2 eggs. They have mammary glands, so they secrete milk that the young, which we call puggles, lap. Platypuses don't have teeth. They have grinding pads, which they mush their food, which are the macroinvertebrates or the spineless bugs. Platypuses actually are born with 1 tiny tooth to help them tear open the egg, but then that disappears. Both males and female platypuses are hatch with spurs. The female platypus has a tiny vestigial spur. It's about 1 or 2 millimeters in size, and it really disappears within the first 6 months. But the males have much more developed spurs that carry quite a punch. They're venomous. The use of these venomous spurs is for males fighting off each other to become territorial in the breeding season, when we see increased fighting of males, scarring. And really, I've never been spurred, but I'm told that the pain could be excruciating depending on the type of venom, and pain for up to 6 months, and standard painkillers, morphine doesn't help. So it's really very much an immobilizing pain. Platypuses have the webbing on their front feet to swim, and like that video on the left, when they're walking over land, they're actually walking on their knuckles. They have a highly developed and sensitive bills that pick up electro and mechano. They have electro and mechanoreceptors, so they pick up minute electric signals from their prey and the movements in the water, and they kind of filter feed at the bottom through the leaf litter. They close their eyes and ears, they dive, and they kind of sift through that leaf litter and really suck that food. And for some weird reason, they have 5 pairs of sex chromosomes, which we haven't really deducted why that is. So the life cycle of platypuses, so I guess in terms of like revolves around the breeding season, where we see adult males starting to fight. They become territorial, so they fight for access to prime habitat and access to females, and so we see that increased fighting around September, and then females will avoid the males until they're ready to copulate. And so the avoidance is, we see that in time. They might just come out and forage at different times and escape to their burrows when the males show up. And when they're ready, there's a very kind of endearing copulation, swimming around in circles. And then the female will start constructing her nest. She could reuse previous ones and repurpose old ones and or construct new ones. Gestation is usually 2 weeks, and then incubation is another 2 weeks, and then the puggles hatch, and the mom will rear her young until late January, so it would be all up about 4 months. She has to work a lot to feed her young. At the later stages, the mom would spend almost all of the time out foraging and resting, and then only spending a couple of hours a day to feed her young. And after that, we really don't know. It's a bit of a mystery. How long, like what sort of, I guess, how long do the juveniles stay in their natal area? At what stage do they disperse? How far they disperse? So those kind of insights we're slowly gaining. Usually a female platypus would lay 1 or 2 eggs. So and would breed every second year or so. So generally the reproduction rate of platypuses is relatively low, which increases, unfortunately, or decreases the viability when populations decrease. So platypuses inhabit a wide range of environments and climates. They extend all the way from far north Queensland around Cooktown all the way down to Tasmania in our alpine regions. They're active year-round of trapped platypuses in sub-zero temperatures. And really, they're quite adapted. They have a physiological tolerance. They can't, their body temperature can't exceed 32 degrees. So their nominal body temperature is kind of 28 to 32. And that's something in a sense of concern in a drier and hotter climates when rivers dry up or water temperatures in far north Queensland rise. Platypuses could experience heat stroke and mortality. So that's something that's definitely can occur. Their morphology ranges quite considerably. Males are standard, normally they're bigger than females by about 50%, and we see quite a size variation across this range. Platypuses are generally smaller in far north Queensland and warmer climates, and much bigger in Tasmania. The males can be up to 3 kilos in Tasmania and could be 1 kilo, 1.5 kilos in Queensland. And in New South Wales, we kind of generally see males at about 1.5 to 2 kilos, and they're about, with tail included, they're about 60 centimeters long, and the females are about, I would say, usually about like a kilo around New South Wales, and a bit shorter, maybe about 50 centimeters long. When it comes to platypus habitat and how do we define it, and how do we can all envision what constitutes as good habitat. We think about clear waters. We're thinking about riparian vegetation, overhanging vegetation. We're thinking about an abundance of organic material, leaf litter, fallen logs, like a complexity of substrate that can support an abundant food web. For platypuses, they need to dig their burrows in the sides of banks. So we're thinking about consolidated earthen banks that can support the burrows. And we're thinking about deep water holes that can be that can support platypuses year round, including periods of extreme drought. So we're thinking about like ideal range would be about 1 meter to 4 meters deep pools. That's their ideal foraging habitat. But when it comes to actually developing quantifiable metrics that will allow us to relate that to actually how many platypuses can inhabit a stream, we're still very much in the dark. So we're working on developing these, I guess, indices and metrics and relate that to carrying capacity and densities. And obviously, it becomes more complex when you're thinking about the spatial connectivity and other threats. But really, if you took me to a river and asked me how many platypuses are here, I couldn't tell you with confidence. It could be anywhere. In some places, we come and we see, we estimate like 12 platypuses per kilometer of river. In others, it might be as low as 1 or 2 platypuses per kilometer. In standard, I would, again, I'm generalizing, but normally I would say it's about 4 platypuses per kilometer of a waterway, a healthy way. So when we are trying to estimate how many platypuses are in existence presently across their range, there's quite a series of assumptions that we have to do. And we end up with quite a large variation here in terms of our estimates. Like it could anywhere between 30,000 and 300,000. So, we would kind of can fall somewhere in the middle and say, oh, there's probably about 100,000 platypuses maybe across their range. But again, this is a significant variation, I guess, or low level of certainty in terms of actually how many platypuses are in existence at the moment. But so we're working very hard at trying to develop quantifiable metrics. Here on the right, we did the study in ACT where we're using drones and radio telemetry. We're mapping burrows of platypuses, which ones are nesting, which ones are resting. And we're developing metrics that would give us an estimate about the probability of that area being used by platypuses. So we're getting there, and there are quite accurate estimates in a particular area, but to actually go and extrapolate that across a wide range, we're still working hard at it. But generally, nesting and resting burrows, if you see here the figure on the left, there's quite a difference in terms of the requirements for nesting and resting. While resting burrows are normally about 1 meter from the water and maybe about anywhere between 1 and 5 meters away from the water's edge, the nesting burrows, the females construct them quite a far away from the water edge to minimize the risk of inundation, particularly. So it really doesn't depend on the fluctuation of the water levels. But nesting burrows can be, on average, where we did the study, we're 2 meters above the water's edge and extended as much as 10 meters away from the water edge. So if you're thinking about what are the minimum requirements for our riparian zone that can stabilize and support platypuses, and we're thinking about at least 15, if not 20 meters of a buffer zone. So in many places where we work, you see one line of trees normally, and when restorations usually take place, it's just a single line. But in actuality, we really need to see a second and maybe even a third line of trees in terms of like a proper riparian zone for platypuses. Unfortunately, platypuses are impacted by a whole suite of threats, starting with hunting in the late 1800s until a ban in 1912. We looked at the fur trade records, and thousands of platypuses were traded for their fur. You can still go to the Australian Museum and see a rug there. Like these accounts of Trappers shooting over a dozen platypuses in a day are not uncommon. And then moving on to some like other prominent threats, land clearing, both at the catchment scale as well as at the riparian zone, promote erosion and destruction of habitat, filling up of pools. Even erosion at the catchment scale of the watershed, loss of topsoil and erosion through intensive agricultural practices, end up in our rivers and are really smothering and destroying habitat. Fragmentation, either through habitat destruction, construction of dams, culverts, weirs, roads, all of that fragment population, and really increase the chances of populations disappearing, local extinctions without any capacity for recolonization. And then introduction of invasive species that definitely had a big impact. And all of those are really synergistic and compounding, where you can think about a river and erosion, destroying of habitat, lowering carrying capacity, which makes it dry much faster during droughts. And then predators, foxes, we know increased predation on platypuses during dry periods. And the populations are fragmented, and platypuses can't access deep pools further downstream. All of those really are compounding and impacting platypuses. In terms of the conservation status of the platypus, in the state in South Australia, it's listed as endangered, where it's pretty much wiped from the mainland, apart from an inbred population in a small reserve in Adelaide, and introduced population on Kangaroo Island. In 2021, it was listed as vulnerable, entry level to the threatened category in Victoria. But the platypus isn't listed under the EPBC Act federally, nor in any other states. In 2021, we did an assessment. We tried to evaluate the conservation status of the platypus and submitted our assessment to the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, along with like every line of data that we could muster. It was a significant collaboration with every platypus researcher out there. There are not that many, but giving case studies about the impacts of urban environments, did some like fancy models showing the impact of fragmentation and habitat loss. And using a lot of it was using a significant proportion of our assessment was using opportunistic sightings, or any sightings that have been provided by the public or researchers. And just based on the sightings and trying to quantify the recency of records as a metric of decline, we saw that in many areas like New South Wales and Queensland, the numbers were very close to 30%. And the entry level is 30% in a span of 3 generations, which is for platypus is 7 years, so it's 20 years. So yeah, so unfortunately the committee said that there wasn't enough information, and we're now back to square one in a sense, where we're not collecting. There's no national or state level monitoring framework for platypuses. No one's regularly collecting that information, and so we're just business as usual in a sense, which is very frustrating. We know that platypus numbers have declined significantly. This is our study we did. We looked at the Trove, a digital library of all the historic newspaper records in Australia going back 100 and odd years ago, and we came across a significant number of like people's account of seeing platypuses in numbers that we regularly are far greater than what we see today. There's this Mr. and Mrs. Hill in 1859 here saw at least 100 of them, even if they're exaggerating by I don't know how much. Like to just that concept or referring to a mob of platypuses. There's another account of seeing a migration of platypuses moving downstream as the wider river was drying out. And you see these accounts of just like dozens of platypuses. Is someone able to shoot 16 or 18 platypuses in a few hours? I try and catch platypuses and do my best when they're active, and I like the highest number of patents, 8. So there's without a doubt numbers have significantly declined, but this is the problem in terms of like without the baseline data, there's this shift in our collective memory of how conditions were in the past. So that really promoted me to develop this web app. It's called the Platy Project with the Australian Conservation Foundation, and it's really it syncs. It does a live sync with Atlas of Living Australia, and it gives people capacity to look at areas where the recency of records based on the colors, and that is an indication of potential decline, but also a way for us to prioritize our efforts and actually go to those areas, not the green ones where there was recent observations, but actually try and tackle those reds, orange, and yellows, and even those gray areas that you can see, particularly in Queensland. There's such a significant gap in our understanding of platypus ranges. Like a most recent assessment that I've been doing with Platy Project seems to suggest, again, significant declines at around about 30%. It really depends at what scale you're looking at. But you can see those really like huge gaps in our ability to know exactly where platypuses are. And it's feasible nowadays with environmental DNA that we're applying, where you just go and you take a water sample and you get an understanding of whether platypuses inhabit that water or not. It's really easy to finally and once and for all address this issue. I've got like a dollar figure. I can do it in a year in a sense. And once and for all get a good understanding of where platypuses exist currently and accurately measure potential declines. I'll give you one example of this impact of fragmentation, where this kind of these fancy models of looking at like populations based on what we know in terms of the life history of platypuses and slowly imposing fragmentation and different impacts to the population. And we can see populations disappearing over time as without any capacity for colonization. And I want to show you one example that unfortunately supports this idea is the surveys we're doing in the Murray-Darling Basin. I'll draw your attention. This is environmental DNA application we're doing. In the map on the right, if you can see those red dots are absences of platypuses and those blue dots are detections. So the top left, their map is Queensland, Pike Creek, above Glenline Dam. And then on the bottom right, it's the Peel River upstream and downstream of Chaffey Dam. And we weren't detecting any platypuses there. And those areas stand out because they're relatively short. And so we fear that just because of probably like droughts and no capacity for platypuses to seek to access refuge downstream, the populations may have gone extinct there without any capacity for recolonization. Sorry, I should have clicked that one before. In Pike Creek, there's an account of platypuses were found in nearly every waterhole, and now we can't detect them. And in Nundle on the Peel River, last record was 2008. So that might have been a local extinction as recent as 2019 drought. So in an area where there's significant impacts to habitat and fragmentation, we are now in a situation where we have to assume the role of natural processes, which we call like in terms of meta populations. So you've got a lot of populations and they're naturally supposed to be connected by movements of individuals between them. But when you're fragmenting those populations, then we need to step in and assist these populations, which includes translocation, rescue, and reintroduction. In 2019, during the height of the drought, we rescued only a handful of platypuses. There wasn't any capacity to rescue more, but we were getting a lot of concern, members of the public calling and talking about platypuses dying in their waterways. I'm happy to say that as a result of that, Karonga built a huge rescue facility out at Western Plains Zoo that can house up to 65 platypuses. And we're developing and collaborating with them and developing a framework where when the next drought hits and when we do need to rescue platypuses, we're very much in position to do that. Of course, we need to take into considerations genetics and maybe like potentially like triage, like there's just a limit of how many we can collect. But also the positive side of that is also the capacity to reintroduce animals. There's no captive breeding. There's no successful captive breeding program or pool that we collect. So any reintroduction that we need to do has to be from wild to wild. Um, Platypuses have been introduced to Kangaroo Island and on a couple of occasions in Victoria. And most recently, we introduced platypuses to the Royal National Park, and trying to this process has been very much focused on trying to understand as much as we can about doing that in and maximizing success rates and making sure that we're have a good understanding of the habitat when we do that, and an understanding of the establishment phase of platypuses and how successful that is. So we're really this project that we did of reintroducing platypuses to the Royal National Park is really aimed at, of course, bringing back platypuses to the park, but also trying to learn as much as we can about this process. So the reintroduction of platypuses to the Royal National Park is really an iconic species, an iconic park. Platypuses used to inhabit the park, disappeared maybe 50, 20 years ago. We don't really know why. It could be a combination of fragmentation, drought, maybe a legacy. There's the issue with the coal mine, and they've been in operation for over 100 years. So maybe their operation has been very different in the past. I can tell you how it is at the moment. But so when we moved in and evaluated the Royal National Park, we did extensive surveys, mapped out the habitat, did the bathymetry, the depth profile of the river, did very intensive macroinvertebrate surveys and water quality surveys along the Hacking and Kangaroo Creek. With this instance from a very warm thank you from Friends of the Royal that have been also supporting us. And everything suggested that the Royal National Park could support platypuses. And New South Wales Parks and Wildlife for the first time started fox baiting, so that is controlling the fox population in the park. And we reintroduced last May 10 platypuses, 6 females and 4 males. They had a quick stopover at Taronga, where we were kind of feeding them a lot. We implanted little trackers in them and then released them last year, and set up this array of listening stations that can pick up the movement of the animals. And really, we were tracking them and could see, that's just a figure there that shows, for us, it's like the river position of where the platypuses are inhabiting the waterway. And I would love to just to point your attention to, there are 2 females. It's hard for you to see, but the top left and then the second row, the second from the left, are 2 females that we think, well, we know one of them successfully bred. We did trapping earlier this year and caught a juvenile platypus. And we did genetic testings, and we know who the mom is. We know who the dad is. But there are 2 females that really exhibited very similar behavior. One we know bred, and the other we think is also bred, with the male, which is at the bottom left there. So that was really good news for us, to actually see successful breeding. We don't know how many juveniles are there in the park, and so we've been tracking these animals ever since. We've had issues with the recent floods. We've lost quite a number of receivers, and some of them got covered by sediment. So we're just in the process of, we've just fixed them and repositioned them, and we're collecting the data again before the tags lose battery. But as of the past 3 months, we were detecting 7 out of the 10 platypuses. The other 3, we don't know. There are some gaps in our ability to detect. Some went up the Kangaroo Creek. Mortality is obviously also a possibility. So, but that's part of the challenge, I guess, with any reintroduction, but especially with platypuses, that they're really hard to track and study. So, as it stands, 7 out of 10, including breeding, it means that we're very successful with our aspiration. And we're now, based on this, we're hoping to introduce more animals next year. dependent on funding. So it's a bit of negotiations now with the New South Wales government. Yeah, so we're not really like, we haven't like fully secured everything that we need actually, because there's a lot of effort to actually go collect animals from wild populations and bring them and so forth. So we're still in negotiations, but I'm really hopeful that we can go ahead with this next year, mid next year, and introduce a few more animals to the park. And the last point, really, where we're headed is I work a lot, like protection of platypuses and waterways is fundamentally dependent on communities and landowners. So national parks are great, but most of the waterways meander through private property with various different land uses. And so really to support and ensure that platypus populations are thriving, the appropriate scale of any effort, any conservation work really needs to happen at the watershed or at the catchment scale. And that is very complex, and it would be a catchment by catchment, because the land uses, this is like a map of land uses across some parts of New South Wales and Queensland. You can see that it varies quite a lot. And it really depends. It's a catchment by catchment, working with all the various stakeholders, communities, people with an interest in their livelihoods, but also in protecting waterways. And that's something we're aspiring to develop over the coming years. And so really promoting and improving connectivity and developing priorities for working with land care about prioritizing corridors along waterways and so forth, and working with communities to promote like monitoring of platypuses and so forth. So yeah, there's still a lot to be done. So yeah, really thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I would say absolutely. It wouldn't have to be in national parks, not at all. I'm working with a number of, this like reintroduction of platypuses to the Royal really excited a number of communities. And unfortunately, destruction of habitat can happen overnight, but the restoration takes almost a lifetime in a sense. And I've heard recently, communities that have been like restoring their habitat in their waterways for over 20 years and are only now seeing platypuses come back to these degraded systems that are now restored. So I definitely would aspire to start working with private landowners, and there's a lot of crossovers in terms of like improving the quality of waterways and ensuring that farmers are thriving and have a good livelihood. For instance, like I come across a lot of new generation of farmers that have, it's the third, fourth generation of farmers on the land, but they've seen the degradation of their topsoil and are now turning back to more sustainable practices of regenerative farming and controlling the amount of, minimizing the amount of erosion, and they see the benefits through improved resilience during drought and so forth. So there's a lot of work that we can do together, hand in hand, making sure that communities prosper as well as their waterways. But I would definitely encourage communities and private landowners to start restoring their waterways and work collectively to make sure, because you can work on your little patch, but if it's a desert on either end, platypuses are probably not going to come back. But if you start building like a long stretch of river, then you might actually see the recolonization happen independently of reintroduction.